There's a particular kind of exhaustion that settles in the bones of those who have learned to be unbreakable. It's the quiet weariness that comes from years of holding yourself steady when everything inside feels like it's falling apart. You know this feeling, don't you? That familiar weight of being the one everyone turns to, the one who never cracks, the one whose shoulders seem broad enough to carry whatever life places there. But beneath that steady exterior, there's a different story unfolding. A story of a person who learned, perhaps very early on, that strength wasn't just admired, it was required. That vulnerability wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. And so you built something magnificent and exhausting. The perfect performance of someone who never needs help, never breaks down, never admits when the weight becomes too much to bear. If you've ever found yourself smiling through pain you couldn't share, or saying I'm fine when everything feels impossible, or pushing through when your body begs for rest, you understand the complex psychology of performed strength. Tonight, as we settle into quiet exploration, we're going to look at this together. The beautiful, burdensome art of pretending to be stronger than you feel, and what it costs the tender human heart beneath all that armour. Now, dim those lights, get cozy, settle into your pillow, and let yourself relax. Take a breath. Tonight you don't have to be strong for anyone, not even yourself. Perhaps it began earlier than you remember, in those formative years when your small hands first learned to wipe away tears before anyone noticed them falling. Maybe it was the day you realised that grown-ups had their own storms to weather, and adding your thunder to theirs felt selfish, overwhelming, or simply unsafe. Children who grow up to perform strength often start as little caretakers, sensing the emotional climate of their homes and adjusting their own needs accordingly. There's something almost magical about a child's ability to read the room, to sense when the adults around them are stretched thin, when the household is walking on eggshells, when one more problem might tip the delicate balance everyone is trying to maintain. You learned this language of emotional weather before you could tie your shoes, before you could read a clock, before you understood that children weren't supposed to carry the weight of grown-up feelings in their small bodies. You might remember the way you started swallowing your own disappointments when you sensed your parents were already drowning in theirs. The way you stopped asking for things when money was tight, not because anyone told you to, but because you could feel the tension that followed every request. The way you began comforting others instead of seeking comfort for yourself, because somewhere in your developing mind you understood that being the one who gave rather than received felt safer, more secure, less likely to result in rejection or frustration. This early training in emotional self-sufficiency doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process, like water slowly carving stone. Each time you choose to be strong instead of vulnerable, each time you offer your own comfort instead of asking for it, each time you minimize your own needs to make space for someone else's, you're building what will become the architecture of your emotional life. You're learning that strength isn't just admired, it's required for love, for belonging, for safety in a world that feels unpredictable and overwhelming. And so you became fluent in the art of carrying weight that was never meant to be yours. You learned to hold your tears until you were alone, to solve problems you didn't create, to be the steady one when everyone else was falling apart. It felt natural, this role of the little adult, because it gave you something precious and rare, a sense of control in a world that often felt chaotic. A way of earning love through usefulness when unconditional acceptance felt too risky to trust. The remarkable thing about children is how they adapt. how they find ways to survive and even thrive in environments that ask more of them than they should have to give. You didn't know you were sacrificing something essential. Your right to be cared for, your permission to have needs, your understanding that love doesn't have to be earned through performance. You just knew that being strong worked, that it made the adults around you proud, that it kept the peace, that it made you valuable in a way that felt permanent and secure. And so begins the story that follows so many into adulthood. The story of strength as survival, of capability as currency, of emotional armor built one small decision at a time. In some households, love flows most freely toward the child who causes the least trouble, who solves the most problems, who carries the most emotional labor without complaint. You learned early that being strong wasn't just a personality trait, it was a survival strategy, a way of securing your place in a world that seemed to reward those who never needed anything from anyone else. This isn't necessarily malicious or intentional. Parents and caregivers often gravitate toward the child who seems most capable, most resilient, most able to handle whatever life throws their way. It makes sense from their perspective. Why worry about the child who always seems fine when there's another child melting down, or bills to pay, or marriages to navigate, or their own childhood wounds demanding attention? The strong child becomes the easy child, and the easy child often becomes the overlooked child, even when that oversight is wrapped in praise and admiration. You learn to read the subtle mathematics of family affection. You noticed which behaviours earned smiles and which earned sighs. You observed that tears brought impatience while solutions brought appreciation. You discovered that being helpful made adults light up in ways that being needy never did. And so you began to shape yourself around this equation, moulding your personality to fit the role that seemed most likely to secure love and belonging. The family system, whether consciously or not, began to rely on your strength. You became the one who could be counted on, the one who wouldn't add to the chaos, the one who might even reduce it. Your siblings learned they could come to you with problems. Your parents learned they didn't have to worry about you the way they worried about everyone else, and you learned that your value was directly tied to your capacity to remain steady when others couldn't. This dynamic creates what psychologists call a family role, a part you play that serves the system's needs but may not serve your own development. The strong child, the caretaker child, the responsible one. These roles feel natural because they develop gradually, organically, in response to the real needs of the people you love. But they come with a hidden cost that often doesn't become clear until much later. You began to believe, on a level deeper than conscious thought, that love is conditional, that it must be earned through usefulness, that your worth is measured by how little you need and how much you can give. That vulnerability is a luxury you can't afford because someone has to be the strong one, and that someone has always been you. And perhaps most significantly, you learned that your own feelings and needs come second to maintaining the emotional equilibrium of everyone around you. Your fears became less important than calming theirs. Your dreams became less urgent than solving their problems. Your pain became less valid than managing theirs, not because anyone told you this explicitly, but because the family equation seemed to work best when you were giving rather than receiving, supporting rather than being supported. This early training in emotional self-sacrifice becomes so woven into your identity that it feels like personality rather than adaptation, like strength rather than survival, like love rather than the complex dance of a child trying to secure their place in an imperfect world. There are words that get stuck in the throat of someone who pretends to be strong. Words like, I'm struggling, or I need help, or I can't do this alone. These phrases become foreign, almost forbidden, because somewhere along the way you absorb the message that speaking them would disappoint someone, burden someone, or reveal something about yourself that felt too dangerous to share. The language of vulnerability becomes like a foreign tongue you never learn to speak fluently. You can understand it when you hear others use it. In fact, you're often the one who invites others to share their struggles, who creates space for their admissions of difficulty, who responds with compassion when they reveal their humanness. But when it comes to your own mouth, your own experiences, your own moments of falling apart, the words simply won't come. It's not that you don't feel the struggles. The overwhelm is there, pressing against your chest like a weight you can't quite lift. The exhaustion is real, settling in your bones after days of being everyone's rock. The fear lives in your stomach. The uncertainty clouds your thoughts. The sadness pools in places you try not to look. You feel all of it, but somewhere between feeling and speaking, something stops you. Maybe it's the memory of being told you were so mature for your age whenever you handled difficulty without complaint. Maybe it's the praise you received for being such a strong person whenever others fell apart and you remained standing. Maybe it's the way people's eyes would glaze over the few times you tried to share your own struggles, as if they couldn't quite compute that you, the strong one, might also be human. Over time, you developed an internal editor, a voice that reviews your words before they leave your mouth, censoring anything that might sound like weakness, neediness, or admission that you're not as capable as everyone believes you to be. This editor becomes so automatic that you often don't even notice it working. You just know that when someone asks how you're doing, fine or good or can't complain comes out your mouth even when your world feels like it's crumbling. The irony is that you've become fluent in everyone else's emotional vocabulary. You can speak comfort, offer solutions, provide the exact words someone needs to hear when they're struggling. You're often the person others turn to precisely because you seem to understand pain without being consumed by it. Because you can hold space for difficulty without falling apart. But this gift, this ability to be present for others' pain, somehow makes it even harder to claim space for your own. You've learned to speak in code about your own struggles. Instead of saying, I'm overwhelmed, you say, it's been busy. Instead of I'm scared, you say, I'm just trying to figure things out. Instead of I need support, you say I'm handling it. These phrases feel safer because they hint at struggle without fully claiming it, without asking for the kind of response that direct vulnerability might require. The most painful part is how this silence becomes self-perpetuating. The longer you go without speaking your truth, the more foreign it feels. The more you present yourself as endlessly capable, the more people come to rely on that version of you. The more you solve other people's problems, the more it seems like you couldn't possibly have problems of your own that need solving. After years of showing the world your strongest self, something strange happens. You begin to forget where the performance ends and the real you begins. The mask of capability becomes so familiar that you wear it even when you're alone, even when there's no one left to impress or protect or reassure with your unwavering composure. This is perhaps the most disorienting part of performing strength, the way the performance eventually becomes automatic, unconscious, as natural as breathing. You've practiced being strong for so long that you no longer need to consciously choose it. Your body holds itself differently. Your voice takes on certain tones. Your face arranges itself into expressions of calm competence without any deliberate effort on your part. You might catch glimpses of this in quiet moments when you're alone, when you notice that even in private you're still holding your shoulders in that familiar position of readiness, still scanning your environment for problems to solve, still mentally cataloguing the needs of everyone around you even when they're not present. The role has become so integrated into your sense of self that you're not sure who you would be without it. The mask doesn't feel like a mask anymore. It feels like your face. The performance doesn't feel like acting. It feels like personality. You've become so convincing in the role of the strong one that you've convinced yourself, creating a kind of emotional amnesia about who you were before you learned to be unbreakable, about what you felt before you learned to manage everyone else's feelings instead. This integration of the false self can be surprisingly thorough. You might find yourself automatically offering solutions before you've even heard the full problem. You might notice that your first instinct in the emotional situation is to figure out how to fix it, rather than simply feel it. You might realize that you've become so skilled at managing crisis that you unconsciously create situations that require your particular brand of steady strength. The most striking thing is how this performed strength begins to feel like the most authentic version of yourself, even when it's actually preventing authenticity. You've been strong for so long that you can't remember what it felt like to be uncertain, to admit confusion, to say "I don't know," without immediately following it with a plan to figure things out. The performance has become so seamless that it's no longer performance, it's become who you believe you are. And yet, underneath all of this, there's often a nagging sense that something essential is missing, that you're living slightly outside of your own life, that you're doing everything right, but somehow not feeling quite real. This isn't weakness surfacing, it's authenticity, trying to find its way back to the light through all the layers of learned strength. For those who pretend to be strong, being needed becomes a drug more powerful than any substance. Your worth gets tangled up in your usefulness. Your identity becomes inseparable from your ability to solve, fix, support, and endure. The thought of not being the strong one terrifies you because it raises the question, if you're not strong, who are you? This addiction to being needed operates below the level of conscious awareness, but its effects are profound and far-reaching. You find yourself drawn to people who require rescuing, to situations that demand your particular brand of calm capability, to relationships where you can be the giver rather than the receiver. It's not that you consciously seek out dysfunction or crisis. It's that these dynamics feel familiar, comfortable, like coming home to yourself. There's a rush that comes from being the one with the answers, the one who can handle what others can't, the one who remains calm when everyone else is panicking. This feeling of indispensability creates a powerful feedback loop. The more you're needed, the more valuable you feel, the more your identity becomes wrapped up in your capacity to be strong for others. It's intoxicating in a way that's hard to recognize because it feels so virtuous, so selfless, so admirable. But like any addiction, this need to be needed comes with tolerance. You require increasingly dramatic situations to feel that same sense of purpose and worth. A friend's minor disappointment doesn't provide the same rush as a full-blown crisis that requires your intervention. A colleague's small request doesn't satisfy the same way as being the one to save the day when everything falls apart. You might find yourself unconsciously disappointed when problems resolve themselves without your help, when people find their own solutions, when the world continues spinning without requiring your particular brand of strength. The most insidious part of this dynamic is how it masks itself as virtue. Society celebrates the strong ones, the helpers, the people who can be counted on. You receive praise for your reliability, gratitude for your support, admiration for your composure. This external validation feeds the addiction, making it seem not just acceptable, but admirable to organize your entire sense of self around your usefulness to others. Underneath this addiction lies a terror that's often too frightening to examine directly. The fear that you have no inherent worth apart from what you can do for others. If you're not solving problems, what value do you bring? If you're not being strong, what reason do people have to love you? If you're not needed, who are you? These questions feel too dangerous to explore because they threaten the entire foundation upon which you've built your sense of self. And so the cycle continues, this beautiful, exhausting dance of strength and service, of giving and receiving validation, of being indispensable and feeling trapped by that very indispensability. You become the person everyone turns to, and in becoming that person, you lose touch with the person you might have been if you'd been allowed to simply be human rather than endlessly, perfectly strong. The walls you built to keep pain out have an unfortunate side effect. They also keep love from getting in. What began as emotional protection gradually becomes emotional isolation, and you find yourself trapped behind barriers of your own making, watching intimacy happen from a safe but lonely distance. These walls weren't built overnight. They were constructed brick by brick, decision by decision, each time you chose safety over vulnerability, each time you decided that feeling less was better than risking feeling too much. You built them carefully, strategically, like an architect designing the perfect fortress. High enough to keep out rejection, thick enough to muffle criticism, smooth enough that nothing painful could find a foothold and climb over. And they worked, these walls. They protected you from the sting of disappointment when people let you down. They shielded you from the humiliation of needing someone who couldn't or wouldn't show up. They kept you safe from the particular agony of offering your heart and having it handled carelessly, dismissed, or simply ignored. Behind these walls you learn to be complete unto yourself, self-sufficient and unbreachable. But emotional walls, like physical ones, don't distinguish between what you want to keep out and what you might want to let in. They're remarkably effective at their job, so effective that they begin to filter everything, not just the painful things. The tenderness that others offer bounces off them. The love that people extend gets deflected back before it can reach you. The understanding and connection that might heal the very wounds you're protecting never quite make it through. You might notice this in the way compliments slide off you like water off glass, never quite landing, never quite being absorbed into that place inside you that hungers for recognition. Or in the way people's attempts to comfort you feel awkward, unnecessary, almost intrusive because you've become so accustomed to comforting yourself. Or in the way intimate conversations leave you feeling strangely detached, as if you're watching from outside yourself, participating but not quite present. The cruelest irony is that the very walls you built to protect yourself from loneliness eventually become the source of a deeper, more persistent loneliness. You're safe behind them, yes, but you're also isolated. You're protected, but you're also cut off from the very experiences that make life feel meaningful. The messy, risky, beautiful vulnerability of being truly seen and known by another person. And perhaps the most difficult part is recognizing that these walls, which once felt like survival, now feel like prison. The protection that saved you in earlier chapters of your life becomes the very thing that keeps you from the connection you're seeking in this one. You begin to understand that safety and intimacy exist in tension with each other, that you can't have complete protection and complete connection at the same time. The walls you built with such care begin to feel less like shelter and more like separation, less like strength, and more like a barrier between you and the life you actually want to live. Strong, people often become emotional sponges, absorbing the feelings of everyone around them without realizing they're doing it. You learned to read the room so expertly that you began carrying the mood of every space you enter, taking on anxiety that isn't yours, sadness that isn't yours, responsibility that was never meant to be yours. This emotional absorption happens so gradually, so naturally, that you might not even notice it's occurring. You walk into a room where someone is stressed, and suddenly your own chest feels tight. You sit with a friend who's anxious about their future, and before long you're lying awake at night worrying about their problems as if they were your own. You spend time with family members who are depressed, and you leave feeling heavy, drained, carrying their sadness in your body like a weight you can't put down. Your emotional boundaries became so porous somewhere along the way that you stopped being able to distinguish between your feelings and everyone else's. You developed such a sophisticated radar for other people's emotional states that you began tuning into their inner weather more clearly than your own. Their fear becomes your fear. Their anger becomes your responsibility to calm. Their sadness becomes your mission to fix. This isn't conscious or intentional. It's more like emotional osmosis, a natural consequence of having learned so early to monitor and respond to the feelings of others. Your survival once depended on reading the emotional climate around you, on sensing when someone's mood was shifting, on anticipating emotional storms before they hit. That skill, which served you well as a child, becomes a burden in adulthood when you can no longer turn it off. You might notice this most clearly in how drained you feel after being around certain people, even when they haven't asked anything of you, even when the time together was supposed to be enjoyable. Your body holds their stress in your shoulders, their worry in your stomach, their frustration in the tightness behind your eyes. You carry home emotions that don't belong to you, and you carry them as if they do. The weight of other people's feelings becomes so familiar that you stop recognizing it as weight. You assume everyone feels this heavy after social interactions, that everyone goes home needing hours to recover from the emotional intensity of simply being around others. You don't realize that most people have natural boundaries that protect them from taking on every feeling in their vicinity. This emotional carrying creates a strange kind of exhaustion, not just from dealing with your own life, but from energetically managing everyone else's. You become the repository for fears, anxieties, and sorrows that were never meant to be yours to hold. And because you're so good at it, because you seem so capable of handling it, people unconsciously begin to use you as an emotional container, unloading their feelings onto you because being around you feels like relief to them. The most challenging aspect of this pattern is learning to distinguish what's actually yours to feel from what you've absorbed from others. Your emotional world becomes so crowded with other people's experiences that you lose track of your own authentic responses, your own genuine feelings, your own needs that have nothing to do with managing or fixing anyone else's emotional state. Deep in the heart of every person who performs strength lives a secret terror. The fear of the moment when the facade finally cracks. You've built your entire identity around being unshakable, so the possibility of breaking down doesn't just threaten your composure, it threatens your sense of self, your place in the world, your understanding of who you are. This fear lives quietly in the background of your days, like a low hum you've learned not to hear but can never quite escape. It's the fear that sits behind your careful monitoring of your own reactions, your constant self-surveillance, your vigilance about maintaining the image of someone who has everything under control. You're always aware, on some level, of how close you might be to the edge of your capacity, how much weight you can bear before something gives way. The breaking point represents more than just emotional overwhelm. It represents the complete collapse of everything you've worked so hard to build and maintain. If you're not the strong one, who are you? If you can't handle whatever life throws at you, what value do you bring? If people see you fall apart, will they still need you, still love you, still see you as the person they can count on when everything else falls apart? This fear shapes so many of your choices, often in ways you don't consciously recognize. You avoid situations that might push you past your limits. You say no to opportunities that might demand more vulnerability than you can safely manage. You structure your life to minimize the chances of being overwhelmed, which often means minimizing the chances of being truly challenged, truly surprised, truly alive in the way that requires emotional risk. You become hyper-vigilant about the early warning signs of your own distress, monitoring your stress levels the way someone with a chronic illness monitors their symptoms. You learn to recognize when you're approaching your limit and you adjust, compensate, manage yourself back into the safe zone before anyone notices you are struggling. This constant self-management becomes second nature, but it also becomes exhausting. The irony is that this fear of breaking down often prevents you from accessing the very support that might help you avoid it. You can't ask for help because asking for help feels too much like admitting you're close to the edge. You can't share your struggles because sharing struggles feels too much like the beginning of the breakdown you're trying to prevent. And so, you carry more and more weight alone, which actually increases the chances of the very collapse you're working so hard to avoid. Perhaps the most painful aspect of this fear is how it keeps you trapped in a kind of emotional holding pattern, never allowing yourself to feel the full depth of your own experiences, because feeling too much might lead to that dreaded moment of losing control. You learn to feel just enough to function, but not so much that you risk the complete authenticity that might shatter the carefully constructed image of your unshakable strength. One of the cruelest ironies of performed strength is how it pushes away the very connection you crave. People assume you don't need support, don't struggle, don't hunger for the same comfort and understanding everyone else seeks. Your competence becomes a barrier that keeps others from offering the tenderness you've never learned how to ask for. You've become so good at appearing self-sufficient that people genuinely believe you are. They see your calm competence and assume it reflects inner peace. They witness your ability to handle crisis and conclude you don't experience crisis the way others do. They observe your consistent support of others and assume you don't need that same support for yourself. Your strength, which you developed as a way to stay close to people, actually keeps them at a distance. This creates a particularly painful form of loneliness, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who care about you but don't see you. They love the version of you that you've shown them, the strong, capable, endlessly reliable version. But they don't see the version of you that struggles, that doubts, that sometimes feels small and scared and uncertain. They can't love what they can't see, and you've become an expert at making sure certain parts of yourself remain invisible. People relate to you differently when they see you as the strong one. They bring you their problems but rarely ask about yours. They seek your advice but don't offer their own perspectives on your life. They assume you're handling whatever you're dealing with and focus their attention on the people who seem to need it more. Your competence becomes a kind of emotional camouflage that hides your humanity from view. This dynamic is often unconscious on both sides. You don't deliberately hide your struggles, and others don't intentionally overlook your needs. It's more subtle than that, a gradual process where everyone settles into roles that feel natural and familiar. You become the one who gives, and they become the ones who receive. You become the one who supports, and they become the ones who need support. The reciprocity that characterizes healthy relationships gets quietly lost. The most heartbreaking part is how much you long for someone to see past the performance, to notice the real you underneath all that strength, to offer comfort without being asked, to provide support without being prompted. But your own competence works against this longing. You've become so convincing in your role as the unshakable one that even the people who love you most struggle to imagine you might need the same care and attention they require. And so you find yourself in the strange position of being loved, but not truly known, valued, but not fully seen, appreciated for your strength, but starving for the kind of tenderness that only comes when someone recognizes your beautiful, fragile humanity. Being strong isn't just an emotional state. It's a constant performance that requires tremendous energy. You're always on, always monitoring yourself, always making sure your voice doesn't shake, your smile doesn't falter, your shoulders don't slump under the weight of everything you're carrying. The exhaustion of performed strength is unlike any other kind of tiredness. It's not just the physical fatigue of carrying heavy emotional loads, or the mental fatigue of solving complex problems. It's the bone-deep weariness that comes from never being able to fully relax, never being able to let your guard down completely, never being able to simply exist without managing how you appear to the world. Every interaction requires a certain level of performance energy. You monitor your facial expressions to make sure they convey the right amount of calm competence. You modulate your voice to ensure it sounds steady and assured. You hold your body in ways that project confidence even when you feel anything but confident inside. This constant self-surveillance is exhausting in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. You've become a full-time actor in the role of yourself, but the role requires you to never break character, never forget your lines, never let the mask slip even for a moment. You can't have an off day, can't show up unprepared, can't let anyone see the effort it takes to maintain the performance. The show must go on, and you are both the lead actor and the entire crew responsible for keeping everything running smoothly. The mental energy required for this constant monitoring and adjusting is enormous. Part of your mind is always occupied with the task of being strong, which means you never have access to your full cognitive and emotional capacity for anything else. You're never fully present because part of you is always working, always performing, always ensuring that the image remains intact. This exhaustion compounds over time because you rarely allow yourself the kind of rest that would actually restore you. Even in your downtime, even when you're alone, you often maintain some version of the performance because it's become so automatic you can't simply turn it off. Your body holds the tension of always being ready, always being prepared to be strong for whatever comes next. The cruel irony is that the more exhausted you become, the more energy it takes to maintain the performance of strength. Tiredness makes everything harder, including the task of appearing untired. Overwhelm makes it more difficult to project calm. Sadness makes it more challenging to wear the mask of contentment. And so, you find yourself caught in a cycle where the very thing that's draining you, the performance of strength, becomes more demanding as you become more depleted. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this exhaustion is how little recognition it receives. The world sees your strength, but doesn't see the effort it takes to maintain it. The cost remains invisible, hidden behind the very performance it's creating, and so the exhaustion becomes another burden you carry alone. Many people who perform strength were once children who had to grow up too fast, taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to the adults around them. You became the little therapist, the tiny mediator, the small but steady force holding everything together, and that role followed you into adulthood like a shadow. There's something both remarkable and heartbreaking about a 7-year-old who learns to read adult emotions better than most adults read them themselves, who develops the ability to sense when their mother needs encouragement, when their father needs space, when their siblings need protection from the tension crackling through the house like electricity before a storm. You learn to be the family translator, the one who could explain why Daddy seemed sad, why Mommy was quiet, why everyone needed to be extra careful with their words today. This premature emotional sophistication doesn't develop by choice. It emerges from necessity. In families where the adults are struggling with their own unhealed wounds, their own overwhelming responsibilities, their own emotional storms, children often step in to fill the gaps. Not because anyone asks them to, but because the alternative, watching the people they love fall apart, feels unbearable. You became the family emotional regulator, the one who could sense when someone was about to explode and somehow diffuse the situation before it happened. You learned to offer comfort to adults who should have been comforting you, to solve problems that weren't yours to solve, to carry worry about things like money and marriage and mental health that no child should ever have to understand, let alone manage. Perhaps you were the one who talked your parents through their fights, who helped them see each other's perspectives when they couldn't see past their own hurt. Maybe you were the one who took care of younger siblings when the adults were too overwhelmed to parent. Or you might have been the one who learned to be invisible during the hard times, so competent and self-sufficient that no one had to worry about you on top of everything else they were managing. This role of the little adult comes with a particular kind of loneliness. The loneliness of having insights and carrying burdens that are far too sophisticated for your age. You understood things about relationships, about pain, about human complexity that other children couldn't even imagine. But understanding these things didn't make you an adult. It made you a child with adult responsibilities, which is a fundamentally different and much more difficult thing to be. The tragedy is how this role followed you into your grown-up life. Like a script you memorized so thoroughly you forgot it was a performance. You continued to be the one everyone turned to for stability, wisdom, emotional regulation. You continued to sense what others needed and provide it, often before they even asked. The little therapist became the adult therapist. The tiny mediator became the family peacekeeper. The small, steady force became the unshakable pillar everyone else could lean on. But somewhere inside you, there's still that child who never got to be just a child, who never had the luxury of being protected instead of protecting, who never experienced what it felt like to be the one receiving care instead of constantly providing it. That child still lives in you, and sometimes they get tired of being so responsible, so understanding, so endlessly mature. For someone pretending to be strong, perfection isn't about achievement, it's about survival. Making mistakes feels too risky when you've built your entire identity around being reliable, capable, and unshakable. Perfectionism becomes the prison you build to avoid the vulnerability of being human. Perfectionism and performed strength are intimate partners, each feeding the other in a dance that looks like excellence from the outside but feels like imprisonment from within. You learned early that mistakes were luxuries you couldn't afford when people were counting on you to be steady, reliable, the one who never faltered. Making errors felt like letting people down, and letting people down felt like risking the love and acceptance that seemed contingent on your competence. Your perfectionism isn't about wanting to excel, it's about needing to be safe. When you're the strong one, the responsible one, the one everyone relies on, there's no room for human fallibility. Mistakes don't just reflect poorly on your performance, they threaten your entire identity, your place in the family system, your value in relationships that seem to depend on your ability to always have the right answer, the perfect response, the flawless execution. This creates an exhausting internal pressure that never quite turns off. You find yourself checking and double-checking everything, not because you enjoy thoroughness, but because the alternative, getting something wrong, feels too dangerous to risk. You rehearse conversations before having them, anticipate problems before they arise, plan for contingencies that might never happen, all in service of maintaining the illusion of someone who never struggles, never stumbles, never needs to be helped back up. The cruelest part of perfectionism is how it masquerades as self-improvement while actually being self-protection. You tell yourself you're striving for excellence, but underneath that drive is often a fear so deep you might not even recognize it. The fear that making mistakes will expose you as the imperfect human you actually are, and that revelation will cost you everything you've worked so hard to build and maintain. Your perfectionism becomes a form of emotional insurance, a way of trying to guarantee that you'll never have to face the vulnerability of being seen as flawed, uncertain, or in need of help. But insurance always comes at a cost, and the cost of perfectionism is the ability to be spontaneous, to take risks, to learn through failure, to experience the relief and connection that comes from being accepted, not despite your imperfections, but including them. You might notice this perfectionism in the way you over-prepare for everything, researching and planning and anticipating until you've eliminated as much uncertainty as possible, or in the way you find it almost impossible to delegate important tasks because no one else will do them exactly the way you would, or in the way you criticize yourself harshly for small mistakes that others wouldn't even notice because your internal standards have become impossibly high. The prison of perfectionism is built one impossible standard at a time until you find yourself living in a space so small and so rigid that there's no room for the beautiful messiness of authentic human experience. You become perfect and perfectly isolated, flawless and fundamentally alone. You've mastered the subtle art of redirecting attention away from your own needs and toward everyone else's. When someone asks how you're doing, you expertly pivot the conversation to focus on them instead. It's a magic trick you've perfected, disappearing while remaining fully present. This deflection happens so smoothly, so naturally, that most people don't even notice it's occurred. Someone asks about your day, and somehow within minutes you're discussing their upcoming deadline. A friend inquires about your stress level, and before you know it, you're helping them process their own anxiety. The conversation starts focused on you and ends focused on anyone but you, and you've orchestrated this redirection with such skill that it feels like natural conversation flow rather than deliberate avoidance. You've developed an arsenal of deflection techniques that work so well they've become unconscious reflexes. You answer questions about yourself with questions about others. You share just enough surface-level information to seem open while revealing nothing substantial about your inner world. You use humour to change the subject. Use others' stories to avoid telling your own. Use your natural curiosity about people as a shield that protects you from being genuinely known. This deflection serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It keeps you safe from the vulnerability of being truly seen. It maintains your role as the helper, the supporter, the one who gives rather than receives. It ensures that conversations don't venture into territory that might reveal the depth of your own struggles or needs. And it allows you to feel useful and connected while remaining fundamentally hidden. The art of deflection becomes so refined that you can guide entire conversations, entire relationships, entire social dynamics without ever really showing up as yourself. You become extraordinarily skilled at creating intimacy for others while avoiding it for yourself. People walk away from interactions with you feeling heard, understood, cared for, while you remain essentially unknown to them. But deflection has a cost that compounds over time. The more you practice disappearing from your own conversations, the more isolated you become, even in the midst of connection. People think they know you, but they only know the version of you that asks thoughtful questions and offers wise support. They don't know the version that struggles, that doubts, that needs the same care and attention you so freely give to others. Perhaps most painfully, you begin to lose touch with your own voice, your own thoughts, your own needs, as you become increasingly fluent in everyone else's inner world while remaining a stranger to your own. The deflection that once protected you from vulnerability gradually separates you from your own authentic experience, until you're not sure what you would say about yourself, even if someone insisted on hearing it. This magic trick of disappearing while remaining present eventually becomes a trap, because the very skill that keeps you safe also keeps you alone. The very talent that makes you valuable to others makes you invisible to yourself. Your body holds the history of every smile you forced, every tear you swallowed, every time you straightened your spine when you wanted to collapse, the tension in your shoulders, the tightness in your jaw, the way you hold your breath. These are the physical symptoms of carrying strength that was never meant to be carried alone. The body doesn't lie the way the mind can. While your thoughts can rationalize and your words can minimize, your muscles, your breathing, your nervous system tell the truth about what it's really costing you to maintain this performance of perpetual strength. Your body becomes a repository for all the feelings you couldn't express, all the stress you couldn't acknowledge, all the exhaustion you couldn't admit. You might notice it in the chronic tightness between your shoulder blades, as if you're constantly bracing for the next responsibility to land on your back, or in the way your jaw clenches while you sleep, your unconscious mind still working overtime to maintain control even in rest, or in the shallow breathing that's become so automatic you don't realize you're only using the top third of your lungs, never fully exhaling, never fully releasing the breath you've been holding for years. Your body adapted to the demands of performed strength by creating physical patterns designed to help you maintain composure. Your posture learned to project confidence even when you felt uncertain. Your facial muscles learned to arrange themselves into expressions of calm capability even when chaos swirled inside. Your voice learned to stay steady even when your heart was racing. These adaptations were brilliant in their way. They helped you maintain the performance that felt necessary for survival. But the body wasn't designed to hold this much tension indefinitely. The muscles that learn to brace for impact never learn to truly relax. The nervous system that learned to stay alert for emotional emergencies never learned to settle into genuine rest. The breathing patterns that helped you maintain composure never evolved to include the deep, releasing exhales that would actually restore you. This physical holding creates its own form of exhaustion, not just mental or emotional tiredness, but a bone-deep weariness that comes from muscles that never fully relax, a nervous system that never completely calms, breathing that never fully releases. Your body becomes like a car engine that's constantly running, never allowed to cool down, never given the kind of rest that would allow for true restoration. The most striking thing is how normalized this physical tension becomes. You might not even realize how much chronic stress your body holds until someone points out how high you carry your shoulders, or until you get a massage and feel surprised by how tight everything is, or until you try a breathing exercise and realize how foreign it feels to fully exhale. The body adapted so thoroughly to the demands of performed strength that discomfort became comfort, tension became normal, and holding became the only way your muscles know how to be. People who perform strength often find themselves in relationships where they give much more than they receive. You're drawn to people who need saving, who require your strength, who make you feel valuable through your ability to support them. But these patterns leave you emotionally depleted and secretly resentful. Your relationships often follow a predictable pattern, though you might not recognize it immediately because it feels so natural, so right. You're attracted to people who are struggling, who need help, who could benefit from your particular brand of steady support. There's something magnetic about being needed, about being the one who can offer solutions, stability, and strength to someone who clearly lacks these things. These dynamics feel like love, and in many ways they are love, but it's a particular kind of love that depends on imbalance, on one person consistently giving and the other consistently receiving. You become the rock in relationships with people who are storms, the steady presence for people who are chaos, the problem solver for people who create problems. This feels natural because it activates all your familiar skills, all the ways you learn to be valuable in your earliest relationships. But relationships built around your strength and someone else's weakness create a subtle hierarchy that's difficult to sustain over time. You become the responsible one, the mature one, the one who handles the real world while your partner struggles with basic life management. You become the parent in adult relationships, the caretaker in romantic partnerships, the friend who always gives advice but never asks for it. This pattern repeats across different relationships. Friendships where you're always the listener, never the one who needs to be heard. Romantic partnerships where you're always the supporter, never the one who needs support. Family relationships where you're always the strong one, never the one who's allowed to be vulnerable. The imbalance becomes so familiar that equality feels foreign, reciprocity feels uncomfortable, and being cared for feels almost wrong. What makes these patterns particularly insidious is how virtuous they appear from the outside. You look like the good partner, the devoted friend, the loyal family member. People admire your commitment, your selflessness, your willingness to stand by people through their difficulties. But underneath this admirable exterior, resentment often builds. Resentment that you can't acknowledge because it contradicts your identity as the giving, supportive, endlessly patient one. You begin to feel like you're running an emotional deficit, always giving out more than you're taking in, always supporting others without receiving that same support in return. But because you've never learned how to ask for what you need, because you've built your identity around not needing anything, because the people in your life have learned to see you as the strong one, the pattern perpetuates itself until you find yourself surrounded by people who love you, but don't truly know how to care for you in the ways you're learning to care for them. The voice in your head that demands constant strength is often harsher than any external critic. You've internalized messages about weakness being unacceptable, and now you police your own emotions with a vigilance that would exhaust anyone watching from the outside. This inner critic speaks in the voice of someone who learned too early that showing struggle was dangerous, that admitting difficulty was shameful, that needing help was a sign of fundamental inadequacy. But the voice doesn't sound harsh to you. It sounds like wisdom, like protection, like the voice of someone who knows what's required to survive in a world that doesn't have patience for weakness. The critic operates like an internal security system, constantly scanning your emotional landscape for any sign of vulnerability that might threaten your carefully constructed image of strength. It notices when your voice wavers slightly during a difficult conversation and immediately corrects your tone. It catches the moment your shoulders start to slump under invisible weight and reminds you to straighten your spine. It observes the tears that threaten to form and swiftly redirects your attention before they can fall. This voice becomes so constant, so automatic, that you might not even recognize it as separate from your own thoughts. It speaks in your own mental voice, using your own vocabulary, but its message is always the same. Be stronger, try harder, don't let them see, don't let yourself feel, don't risk disappointing anyone by being human. It's become the background narrator of your life, providing constant commentary on your emotional performance. The cruelest part is how reasonable this voice sounds, how it disguises its harshness as helpfulness. It tells you it's protecting you from rejection, from disappointment, from the pain of being seen as inadequate. It reminds you of times when showing weakness led to problems, when being vulnerable felt dangerous, when strength was the only thing that kept you safe. And so you listen, you comply, you police yourself with a dedication that would impress any drill sergeant. But this internal critic demands a kind of emotional perfection that's impossible to maintain. It expects you to never feel scared, never feel overwhelmed, never feel the simple human need for comfort and support. It sets standards so high that even your private thoughts and feelings come under scrutiny. You begin to judge yourself for having emotions before you can even fully experience them. critiquing your inner world with the same vigilance you apply to your outer presentation. The voice becomes particularly loud during moments of genuine struggle, when you most need compassion for yourself, but instead receive internal criticism for not being stronger, not handling things better, not maintaining the composure that others expect from you. It turns your moments of greatest vulnerability into evidence of your inadequacy, transforming natural human responses into personal failures. What makes this internal dynamic so exhausting is that you're simultaneously experiencing difficult emotions and fighting against experiencing them. You're having a human response to challenging circumstances while also berating yourself for that response. It's like trying to heal a wound while constantly picking at it, ensuring it never quite has the chance to recover. What psychologists call the false self is the version of you constructed to meet external expectations rather than express internal truth. For those who perform strength, this false self becomes so convincing that you sometimes forget there's a more authentic version underneath, one that feels, struggles, and needs support just like everyone else. The false self began as a brilliant adaptation, a way of ensuring safety and belonging in environments that seem to reward certain qualities while punishing others. You learned to emphasize the parts of yourself that were celebrated, your competence, your reliability, your ability to handle anything, while minimizing or hiding the parts that seemed unwelcome, your fears, your needs, your natural human vulnerabilities. Over time, this adaptive self became so well developed, so convincing, that it began to feel like your authentic personality rather than a protective strategy. The false self speaks confidently, moves through the world with apparent ease, handles crises with calm competence, and never seems to struggle with the things that overwhelm other people. It's genuinely impressive, this self you've created, and it's served you well in many ways. But the false self requires constant maintenance, constant performance, constant vigilance to ensure that the real self, the one that feels deeply, struggles honestly, needs genuinely, doesn't accidentally surface and threaten the carefully constructed image. You become like an actor who's been playing the same role for so long that they've forgotten their original personality. Except the stakes feel much higher because this isn't just a performance, it's your life, your relationships, your entire social identity. The architecture of the false self is built on the foundation of what others need you to be, rather than what you actually are. It's constructed from external validation, rather than internal truth, from others' comfort rather than your own authenticity. And while it's remarkably stable and functional, it's also fundamentally hollow because it's not rooted in genuine self-knowledge or self-acceptance. Living through the false self creates a particular kind of existential loneliness, the loneliness of being appreciated for qualities that don't reflect your deepest truth, loved for characteristics that feel like performance, valued for traits that require enormous energy to maintain. People connect with your false self while your true self remains hidden, unknown, unwitnessed, and therefore unloved. The tragedy is how successful the false self becomes, how convincing it is to others and sometimes even to yourself. It gets promoted, praised, relied upon, and loved, which makes it increasingly difficult to consider retiring it in favour of something more authentic. The false self becomes not just a survival strategy, but a prison, keeping your true nature locked away while this more acceptable version receives all the attention and affection. Yet underneath all this careful construction, Your authentic self continues to exist, continues to feel, continues to long for genuine connection and understanding. It lives quietly beneath the performance, sometimes surfacing in dreams, in private moments, in the subtle signs of exhaustion that come from maintaining a version of yourself that requires so much energy to sustain. Beneath every adult who performs strength is often a child whose genuine emotions were dismissed, minimized, or simply too overwhelming for the adults around them to handle. Those early experiences of having your feelings invalidated create a blueprint for hiding your authentic, emotional life from the world. The wounds that create performed strength often begin so early that you don't remember a time before them. Maybe it was the way your tears were met with impatience instead of comfort, the way your fears were brushed aside instead of acknowledged, the way your anger was shut down instead of understood. Perhaps it was subtler than that, the way your emotions seemed to make the adults around you uncomfortable, the way expressing feelings created tension in your family, the way being upset felt like adding to problems that already felt too big for everyone to handle. Children are remarkably sensitive to the emotional climate around them, and when that climate suggests that feelings are burdens, that emotions are problems to be solved rather than experiences to be felt, they learn to adapt by hiding their inner world. You learn to comfort yourself instead of seeking comfort, to minimize your own struggles instead of asking for support, to be strong instead of being real. These early experiences of emotional invalidation don't just teach you to hide your feelings, they teach you that your feelings are somehow wrong, too much, inappropriate, or dangerous. You begin to believe that the emotional responses that feel most natural and spontaneous are actually problems that need to be fixed or hidden. Your authentic emotional life becomes something shameful, something that reveals your inadequacy rather than your humanity. The child who learns that emotions are unwelcome often becomes the adult who struggles to even recognize their own feelings, let alone express them. You might find yourself experiencing a vague sense of distress but unable to identify whether it's sadness, fear, anger, or overwhelm. Your emotional vocabulary becomes limited because you never had the opportunity to learn the subtle distinctions between different feelings, never had your emotions reflected back to you with accuracy and compassion. What makes these childhood wounds particularly persistent is how they shape not just your behavior, but your beliefs about yourself and about relationships. You learn that love is conditional on maintaining a certain emotional facade, that acceptance requires hiding the parts of yourself that feel too complicated or intense. You discover that being needed is safer than having needs, that giving support is easier than asking for it. The child who is too much for their family often becomes the adult who tries to be not enough for everyone else, taking up less emotional space, requiring less care, offering more support than they receive. The adaptation that helped you survive emotionally unavailable or overwhelmed caregivers becomes the pattern that follows you into every relationship thereafter. These wounds don't heal simply because you grow older or move away from the environments that created them. They live in your nervous system, in your unconscious expectations about relationships, in the automatic ways you respond to emotional situations. They're activated every time someone seems impatient with your feelings, every time you sense that your emotions might be inconvenient for others, every time you face the choice between being real and being accepted. Your nervous system learned to stay in a state of hypervigilance, always scanning for threats, always ready to be strong in the face of chaos. This state of constant readiness becomes so familiar that relaxation feels foreign, vulnerability feels dangerous, and softness feels like weakness. The nervous system of someone who performs strength often learned its patterns during times when emotional or physical safety felt uncertain. Whether it was unpredictable family dynamics, overwhelming responsibilities, or environments where being strong was necessary for survival, your autonomic nervous system adapted by staying alert, always ready to respond to the next crisis, the next demand, the next moment when your strength would be required. This hypervigilant state served you well during those early years when you actually needed to be constantly ready, when scanning for emotional storms and preparing to weather them was a legitimate survival strategy. Your nervous system became exquisitely attuned to subtle shift in mood, tone and energy around you, developing an early warning system that helped you prepare for whatever was coming next. But nervous systems that learn to operate in crisis mode often struggle to downshift when the crisis is over. Your body continues to brace for impact even when you're safe. Your mind continues to scan for problems even when everything is peaceful. Your muscles continue to hold tension even when there's nothing to defend against. The state of readiness that once protected you becomes a source of exhaustion that persists long after it's needed. This chronic activation affects everything: your sleep patterns, your digestion, your ability to concentrate, your capacity for joy. When your nervous system is always partially activated, always somewhat on guard, you never fully settle into the present moment. Part of you is always listening for the next emergency, the next person who might need your strength, the next situation that will require your steady presence. Relaxation becomes almost impossible because your system has learned that letting your guard down is dangerous. Vulnerability feels terrifying because your body remembers times when being soft led to being hurt. Asking for help triggers alarm bells because your nervous system equates needing support with being in danger. Even positive experiences can feel overwhelming because your system is calibrated for managing difficulty rather than receiving pleasure. The tragedy is how this nervous system activation masquerades as strength when it's actually a trauma response. The hypervigilance that looks like awareness, the constant readiness that appears to be responsibility, the inability to relax that seems like dedication. These aren't signs of exceptional character, but symptoms of a system that learned too early that safety was never guaranteed. Learning to recognize this nervous system pattern is often the first step toward healing, because you can't change what you can't see. And this particular adaptation is so deeply woven into your identity that it often goes unnoticed until someone points out how much tension you carry, how rarely you seem to truly rest, how your body holds itself like it's always preparing for something difficult to happen. You've become the emotional infrastructure for everyone around you. The one who remembers birthdays, manages conflicts, provides comfort, offers solutions. But emotional labour, when unacknowledged and unreciprocated, becomes a form of invisible exhaustion that slowly drains your capacity for joy. Emotional labour is the largely invisible work of maintaining relationships, managing feelings, and ensuring that social and family systems run smoothly. It's remembering everyone's important dates and preferences, noticing when someone is upset and helping them feel better, mediating conflicts before they explode, providing comfort during difficult times, and generally serving as the emotional glue that holds everything together. For someone who performs strength, this emotional labour often feels natural, even enjoyable. You're good at reading people, at anticipating needs, at providing exactly the kind of support that others require. You take pride in being the one people turn to, the one who remembers what matters, the one who can smooth over rough patches in relationships and family dynamics. It feels like love, and in many ways it is love, but it's a particular kind of love that requires you to be constantly tuned in to everyone else's emotional weather while neglecting your own. The challenge with emotional labor is that it's often invisible, even to the person providing it. You might not recognize how much mental and emotional energy goes into maintaining the relationships around you, because it's become so automatic, so much a part of who you are. You're the one who thinks to check in when someone's going through a hard time, who remembers to celebrate others' successes, who notices when family dynamics get intense, and takes steps to address the tension. This work is valuable, necessary, and meaningful, but when it becomes primarily or exclusively your responsibility, it creates an imbalance that can be profoundly depleting over time. You're giving out emotional energy constantly, comforting, supporting, problem-solving, managing, but rarely receiving the same quality of attention and care in return. Not because people don't love you, but because the role you've taken on makes it seem like you don't need that kind of support. The exhaustion that comes from unacknowledged emotional labor is subtle but persistent. It's not the dramatic tiredness of working too hard or sleeping too little. It's the quiet depletion that comes from always giving out more emotional energy than you're taking in, from always being aware of everyone else's needs while your own needs remain unnoticed, unmet, sometimes even unknown to yourself. What makes this particularly challenging is how virtuous emotional labor appears from the outside. You look like the caring friend, the devoted partner, the thoughtful family member. People appreciate your attention, your memory for details, your ability to provide exactly the right kind of support at exactly the right time. But this appreciation, while genuine, rarely extends to reciprocal care for your emotional needs. Over time, you might begin to feel like you're running on empty, surrounded by people who love and value you, but don't necessarily see how much you're giving or understand that you might need the same kind of emotional attention you provide for them. The very competence that makes you so valuable as an emotional caretaker becomes the thing that keeps others from recognizing that you too are human and might sometimes need care rather than constantly providing it. For many who perform strength, showing vulnerability feels like an invitation for others to leave. You learned early that your value was tied to your usefulness, so admitting struggle or need triggers a primal fear that people will abandon you if you're not constantly proving your worth through your capability. This fear of abandonment runs deeper than conscious thought, living in the part of your nervous system that learned long ago that love was something to be earned rather than something freely given. You discovered early that being strong made people proud, being capable made you valuable, being reliable made you indispensable. And somewhere in that learning, you absorbed the terrifying opposite, that being weak might make you disposable. Being needy might make you burdensome. Being vulnerable might give people permission to walk away. The fear operates like an ancient alarm system, triggering whenever you consider showing the parts of yourself that struggle, that doubt, that need support. It whispers warnings about what might happen if people see you as human rather than superhuman. What if they lose respect for you? What if they stop coming to you for help? What if they decide you're too much work, too complicated, too needy to maintain a relationship with? This fear keeps you locked in patterns of emotional self-sufficiency that feel safe but create the very abandonment you're trying to avoid. By never showing your struggles, you ensure that people never get the chance to love you through them. By never revealing your needs, you guarantee that those needs will never be met. By never being vulnerable, you create relationships that feel secure, but lack the depth that comes from being truly known. The cruelest irony is that this fear of abandonment often creates a kind of emotional abandonment of yourself. You leave your own needs behind in order to keep others close. You abandon your authentic feelings in order to maintain relationships that depend on your performance rather than your presence. You sacrifice your true self to preserve connections that might not survive your honesty. But this fear, while powerful, is often based on outdated information. The child who learned that weakness led to rejection might be surprised to discover that the adult world contains people who are actually drawn to authenticity, who feel relief when the strong people in their lives reveal their humanity, who want to offer care and not just receive it. The fear that vulnerability will drive people away might actually be keeping away the very people who would love you more, not less, for showing them your whole self. The fear of abandonment through weakness is really a fear of discovering what love actually looks like when it's not based on performance. It's scary to find out whether people will stay when you're struggling, but it's also the only way to discover who truly wants to be in your life versus who simply wants to use your strength for their own benefit. Learning to risk vulnerability despite this fear isn't about becoming reckless with your heart. It's about slowly, carefully discovering that authentic connection requires authentic risk, and that the relationships worth having are the ones that can hold your whole humanity, not just the strong parts. There's a particular kind of sadness that lives in people who had to be strong too early. The grief for the childhood you didn't get to have, the protection you didn't receive, the permission to be vulnerable that was never granted. This grief often stays hidden because acknowledging it feels like admitting defeat. This grief is complicated because it's not grief for something you lost. It's grief for something you never had to begin with. You mourn the childhood where someone else was strong so you could be small. You grieve the protection that would have allowed you to feel scared without having to hide it, to feel sad without having to comfort others, to feel confused without having to figure everything out on your own. There's a particular ache in recognizing how early you learned to carry weight that wasn't yours to carry. How young you were when you started reading adult emotions and taking responsibility for managing them. How small you were when you learned that your job was to be the steady one, the mature one, the one who never added to the chaos because someone had to hold everything together. This grief includes mourning the spontaneity you never got to express because you were too busy being careful, the tears you never got to cry because someone needed you to be strong, the fears you never got to voice because there wasn't room for your terror on top of everyone else's. You grieve the child who never got to be purely child, who never experienced what it felt like to be completely protected rather than always providing protection. The sadness often surfaces in unexpected moments. When you see a parent comforting a crying child and realize you don't remember ever being comforted that way. When you watch someone express a need without shame and realize how foreign that kind of directness feels to you. When you observe healthy families and recognize how different your experience was, how much you had to figure out alone. But this grief also carries a particular shame because it feels like ingratitude. After all, you survived. You became strong, capable, resilient. People admire these qualities in you. You should be proud of what you accomplished, grateful for the strength you developed, appreciative of the skills you learned. Mourning what you didn't get feels like diminishing what you did achieve. The truth is that you can be proud of your strength and also sad about the circumstances that required it. You can be grateful for your capabilities and also grieve that you had to develop them so young. You can appreciate your resilience and also feel sorrow for the child who needed to be resilient in the first place. These feelings aren't contradictory. They're the complex emotional truth of someone who survived by learning to be stronger than they should have had to be. Allowing yourself to feel this grief isn't about becoming bitter or angry or resentful. It's about honoring the child who did the best they could with impossible circumstances, acknowledging what that cost and making space for the tender feelings that you never had permission to express. It's about recognizing that strength built too early often comes at the cost of something precious and irreplaceable. The simple experience of being cared for rather than always providing care. Sometimes the greatest gift comes disguised as your greatest fear, the moment when you can no longer maintain the performance of strength. When the mask finally slips, when the walls come down, when the exhaustion becomes too heavy to hide, there's an opportunity for authentic connection that was never possible before. The breaking point feels like the end of everything when you're approaching it. It represents the collapse of the identity you've spent years constructing, the failure of the system that's kept you safe, the exposure of the very vulnerability you've worked so hard to hide. Everything in you fights against this moment, deploys every strategy you've learned to maintain composure, mobilizes every resource to keep the facade intact just a little longer. But sometimes the breaking point comes anyway, despite your best efforts to avoid it. Sometimes the weight becomes too heavy, the performance too exhausting, the gap between your outer strength and inner truth too vast to maintain. Sometimes life delivers more than your carefully constructed defenses can handle, and the walls you built so carefully begin to crack under pressure you can no longer absorb alone. In those moments of collapse, something unexpected often happens. People who thought you were invulnerable discover that you're human. People who saw you as endlessly capable realize that you too have limits. People who relied on your strength find out that you also need support, and often, instead of the rejection and abandonment you feared, something beautiful occurs. Real intimacy becomes possible for the first time. When your mask slips, people finally get to see who you actually are beneath all that perfect composure. When your walls come down, others can finally reach the parts of you that have been hidden, protected, kept safe, but also kept alone. When you can no longer pretend to be stronger than you feel, authentic relationship becomes possible because authentic relationship requires two real people, not one superhuman and one regular human. The breaking point strips away the performance and reveals the person. It shows people your fears, your limits, your genuine need for support. And while this feels terrifying, it also creates the opportunity for the kind of love and care that was never possible when you seemed like you didn't need anything from anyone. Many people discover that their breaking point becomes their breakthrough. The moment when they finally receive the kind of care they've been giving to others for years. The moment when they discover what it feels like to be supported rather than always providing support. The moment when they learn that vulnerability doesn't drive love away but actually invites it closer. The gift of the breaking point isn't that it ends your strength. It's that it begins your authenticity. It opens the door to relationships based on mutual humanity rather than one-sided caregiving. It creates space for you to be loved, not just for what you can do for others, but for who you are when you can't do anything for anyone, including yourself. Recovery from performed strength isn't about becoming weak. It's about becoming real. It's the slow, gentle process of learning that you don't have to earn love through your capability, that your worth isn't tied to your usefulness, that showing your struggles doesn't make you a burden but makes you beautifully, courageously human. This gentle revolution begins not with dramatic change, but with small acts of authenticity. It starts with admitting when you're tired instead of automatically saying you're fine. It grows when you ask for help with something small instead of handling everything alone. It deepens when you share a struggle with someone instead of keeping it private. Each honest moment is a quiet rebellion against the patterns that have kept you trapped in performed strength. The revolution is gentle because forced change rarely lasts. You've been strong for so long that learning to be vulnerable requires patience, practice, and compassion for yourself as you navigate unfamiliar territory. It's like learning to speak a new language, the language of authentic need, genuine feeling, honest struggle. At first it feels foreign, awkward, dangerous, but gradually it begins to feel like coming home to yourself. Learning to be human instead of perfect means discovering that your value doesn't depend on your invulnerability. You begin to understand that the people who truly love you want to know your struggles, not just benefit from your strength. You realize that relationships are supposed to involve mutual support, not just one person endlessly giving while the other endlessly receives. This process involves unlearning as much as learning. You unlearn the belief that your worth depends on your usefulness. You unlearn the fear that people will abandon you if you're not constantly proving your value. You unlearn the idea that love must be earned through performance, and discover that authentic love is given freely to real people with real struggles, real needs, real limitations. The gentle revolution also means learning to treat yourself with the same kindness you've always shown others. You begin to speak to yourself the way you would speak to someone you love who is struggling. You start to offer yourself the same patience, understanding, and compassion that you've freely given to everyone else. You discover that the voice of self-criticism can be replaced with a voice of self-compassion. Recovery doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without setbacks. There are days when the old patterns feel safer, when performing strength seems easier than being authentic, when the familiar exhaustion of keeping up the facade feels more comfortable than the unfamiliar vulnerability of being real. But gradually, authenticity begins to feel less scary and more liberating. Being real starts to feel less dangerous and more alive. True strength isn't the absence of vulnerability. It's the courage to be vulnerable when it matters. The journey leads not to weakness but to integration, where you can be both strong and soft, both capable and needy, both supportive and supported. This is where authenticity lives, in the space between extremes, where your full humanity can finally breathe. Integration means discovering that you don't have to choose between being strong and being vulnerable. You can be both. You can be someone who others lean on, and someone who sometimes needs to lean on others. You can be capable in many areas while acknowledging that you need support in others. You can offer wisdom while also admitting confusion. You can provide comfort while also seeking comfort. This integrated way of being feels revolutionary after years of believing that strength and vulnerability were mutually exclusive. You discover that showing your struggles doesn't diminish your ability to help others. It actually makes your help more authentic, more grounded in genuine understanding rather than distant competence. Your strength becomes more real because it includes the full spectrum of human experience rather than pretending that some experiences don't exist. Real strength emerges from self-awareness, not self-denial. It comes from knowing your limits and honouring them, from understanding your needs and meeting them, from recognising your feelings and expressing them. This kind of strength is sustainable because it's based on truth rather than performance, on authenticity rather than perfection. In this integrated space, you become someone who can be counted on not because you never struggle, but because you're honest about your struggles and deal with them responsibly. You become trustworthy not because you never need help, but because you ask for help when you need it instead of letting problems grow until they become crises. You become reliable not because you never make mistakes, but because you acknowledge mistakes and learn from them. The integration of strength and vulnerability creates the possibility for relationships that are truly mutual, where both people can be strong for each other and vulnerable with each other, where support flows both ways, where love is based on full humanity rather than partial performance. These relationships feel different from anything you've experienced before because they're based on truth rather than image, on authenticity rather than adaptation. Living in this integrated way doesn't mean you lose your strength. It means your strength finally serves your authentic self rather than a false persona. Your capability becomes a tool for creating the life you actually want rather than a prison that keeps you trapped in patterns that no longer serve you. Your ability to support others becomes a choice rather than a compulsion, a gift rather than a duty. And in this space between extremes, where you can be both strong and soft, both capable and needy, both giver and receiver, your full humanity finally has room to breathe, to grow, to be exactly as complex and beautiful and imperfect as it was always meant to be. This integrated way of being requires practice, like learning to speak a new language after spending years in silence. The language of authentic strength feels foreign at first because you're so accustomed to the dialect of performed invulnerability. When someone asks what you need, your mouth wants to form the familiar words nothing or I'm fine. But slowly you learn to pause, to actually consider the question, to offer honest answers that feel both terrifying and liberating. The practice begins in small moments that feel enormous. Maybe it's the first time you admit to a friend that you're overwhelmed instead of automatically asking about their problems. Maybe it's allowing yourself to cry in front of someone instead of excusing yourself to fall apart in private. Maybe it's saying, I don't know, without immediately following it with a plan to figure everything out. These moments of authenticity feel like stepping off solid ground into empty air, but gradually you discover that honesty doesn't lead to the catastrophe you've always feared. Your nervous system needs time to adjust to this new way of being. After years of hypervigilance, of constantly monitoring yourself and others for signs of distress, learning to relax feels almost impossible at first. Your body has become so accustomed to tension that softness feels dangerous. Your mind has become so habituated to scanning for problems that peace feels suspicious. This is normal, even expected, as you transition from survival mode to a way of living that allows for actual thriving. The work of integration involves developing what psychologists call emotional regulation, the ability to feel your feelings fully without being overwhelmed by them or immediately trying to escape them. For someone who learned to perform strength, emotions often feel either completely suppressed or completely overwhelming. You might find yourself going from feeling nothing to feeling everything, with very little middle ground. Learning to exist in the space between emotional numbness and emotional chaos takes time and tremendous patience with yourself. This emotional learning happens in relationship with others who can hold space for your full range of human experience. You might be surprised to discover how many people in your life have been waiting for permission to care for you the way you've always cared for them. When you finally allow others to see your struggles, many respond not with the judgment or rejection you feared, but with relief that they can finally offer something meaningful in return for all the support you've provided over the years. But not everyone will respond to your authenticity with understanding. Some people in your life have become accustomed to you being their emotional rock, their problem solver, their source of steady support. When you begin to show your humanity, some may feel confused, disappointed, or even angry. They've grown comfortable with the imbalanced dynamic where you give and they receive, and your movement toward mutuality might threaten their sense of security. These responses can be particularly challenging because they seem to confirm your deepest fears about vulnerability. That people only love you when you're strong, that admitting struggle will drive others away, that your value really was tied to your usefulness. It's important to remember that these reactions often say more about others' inability to handle authentic relationship than they do about your worth or the rightness of your choice to be real. Learning to navigate these responses requires developing discernment about which relationships can evolve to include your full humanity, and which ones were perhaps always dependent on your performance rather than your presence. This discernment isn't about judgment or blame. It's about recognizing that not all relationships are designed to handle the depth and mutuality that authentic connection requires. Some relationships will naturally deepen as you become more real. Others will gradually fade as you stop playing the role that held them together. And new relationships will emerge, drawn to your authenticity rather than your performance, based on mutual respect and care rather than one-sided support. This shifting of relationships can feel like loss at first, but gradually it reveals itself as a clearing, making space for connections that can hold and celebrate your whole self. The process of becoming integrated also involves learning to recognize and interrupt the internal patterns that kept you trapped in performed strength. You begin to notice the thoughts that automatically arise when someone is struggling. Thoughts like, I should fix this, or I need to make them feel better, or their pain is my responsibility. These thoughts feel so natural, so obviously true, that questioning them might seem strange or even selfish at first. But learning to pause before automatically moving into caretaking mode creates space for more conscious choices about when and how to offer support. Sometimes helping is appropriate and beneficial, sometimes it's not. Sometimes your impulse to fix or rescue is actually preventing someone from developing their own strength and resilience. Sometimes your automatic caretaking is robbing others of the opportunity to experience their own capability. This doesn't mean becoming cold or uncaring. It means becoming more conscious about how and when you offer support, ensuring that your help comes from choice rather than compulsion, from genuine care rather than unconscious programming. It means learning to trust that others are capable of handling their own struggles, even when those struggles are difficult to witness. Developing this kind of discernment requires you to become more aware of your own motivations for helping. Are you offering support because it genuinely serves the other person, or because being needed makes you feel valuable? Are you stepping in because the situation truly requires intervention, or because witnessing someone else's struggle makes you anxious? Are you problem solving because you have useful insights to offer, or because you can't tolerate the discomfort of seeing someone you care about in pain? These questions aren't meant to create self-doubt or self-criticism. They're invitations to develop more consciousness about your patterns so that your actions can align with your authentic values rather than unconscious habits. When your helping comes from conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion, it tends to be more effective, more sustainable, and more satisfying for everyone involved. The journey toward authentic strength also requires developing a new relationship with rest and restoration. For someone who has spent years in constant service to others, learning to rest without guilt is a profound challenge. Your nervous system might interpret rest as laziness, relaxation as selfishness, or taking time for yourself as abandonment of your responsibilities to others. But rest isn't the opposite of strength. It's what makes sustainable strength possible. Learning to honor your need for restoration, for time alone to process your experiences, for activities that nourish rather than drain you, is essential for maintaining the energy required for authentic living. You can't give from an empty cup, and you can't offer genuine support to others when you're running on fumes. This means learning to say no to requests that would deplete you, even when saying no feels uncomfortable or unfamiliar. It means prioritizing activities that restore your energy rather than constantly choosing activities that serve others at your own expense. It means treating your own well-being as essential rather than optional, as a responsibility rather than a luxury. Developing this new relationship with self-care often requires working through layers of guilt and programming that taught you your needs were less important than everyone else's. You might find yourself feeling selfish when you choose rest over productivity, guilty when you spend time on yourself instead of helping others, or anxious when you're not constantly available to provide support. These feelings are normal parts of the transition from performed strength to authentic self-care. The work of integration also involves learning to appreciate the gifts that emerged from your years of performed strength. Your deep empathy, your ability to remain calm in crisis, your skill at reading emotional situations, your capacity to offer comfort and support. These are genuine strengths that developed through your experiences, even if they originated from survival rather than choice. The goal isn't to eliminate these qualities, but to transform them from compulsive patterns into conscious choices. Your empathy becomes a gift when it's balanced with boundaries. Your calm presence becomes a strength when it's chosen rather than automatic. Your ability to offer support becomes a blessing when it flows from fullness rather than depletion. This transformation allows you to keep what serves you while releasing what constrains you. You don't have to stop being caring, supportive, or strong. You just get to choose when and how to express these qualities rather than being driven by unconscious programming that demands constant performance. Learning to live authentically also means developing tolerance for the discomfort that comes with change. Your nervous system, so accustomed to the familiar patterns of performed strength, might resist your attempts to be more real. You might feel anxious when you're honest about your struggles, guilty when you accept help, or uncomfortable when relationships become more mutual. This discomfort is part of the process, not a sign that you're doing something wrong. Changing deeply ingrained patterns requires patience and self-compassion. There will be days when the old ways feel safer, when performing strength seems easier than being vulnerable, when the familiar exhaustion of maintaining a facade feels more comfortable than the unfamiliar territory of authentic relationship. These setbacks aren't failures. They're part of the natural process of change. Each time you notice yourself falling back into old patterns, you have the opportunity to pause, breathe, and choose again. You can gently redirect yourself toward authenticity without judgment or criticism. Change happens gradually, through small choices made consistently over time, not through dramatic transformations that happen overnight. The practice of authentic strength also involves learning to celebrate progress rather than demanding perfection. You might find yourself focusing on the times you reverted to old patterns while overlooking the moments when you chose vulnerability, asked for help, or allowed others to care for you. Learning to notice and acknowledge your growth, even when it feels small or incomplete, is essential for sustaining the motivation required for deep change. This celebration isn't about toxic positivity or pretending that change is easy. It's about recognizing that every moment of authenticity is an act of courage. Every request for support is a step toward freedom. Every time you show your humanity is a victory worth acknowledging. These small acts of bravery accumulate over time, creating momentum toward a way of life that honors your full humanity, rather than just your capacity to serve others. As you continue this work, you might be surprised by how it affects your relationship with your own emotions. Feelings that once seemed dangerous or overwhelming begin to feel manageable when you're not trying to hide them or fix them immediately. Sadness becomes something to be felt rather than escaped. Fear becomes information rather than something to overcome through willpower. Anger becomes a signal rather than something to suppress automatically. This new relationship with emotions creates space for more nuanced, complex responses to life's challenges. Instead of automatically moving into problem-solving mode when difficulties arise, you learn to first simply be present with whatever you're experiencing. You discover that emotions don't need to be fixed. They need to be felt, acknowledged, and allowed to move through you naturally. The integration of strength and vulnerability also creates new possibilities for intimacy in your relationships. When you're no longer hiding behind a mask of perfect capability, others can finally see and love your authentic self. When you're willing to receive care as well as provide it, relationships become mutual exchanges rather than one-sided caregiving arrangements. These deeper connections feel different from anything you experienced while performing strength. They're based on truth rather than image, on mutual humanity rather than one person's superiority, on shared vulnerability rather than one person's invulnerability. The love that emerges from authentic relationship is more satisfying because it's directed toward who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. The journey also involves learning to trust your own inner wisdom rather than constantly looking outside yourself for validation or direction. Years of performing strength often involved ignoring your own instincts in favor of what others needed you to be or do. Reconnecting with your authentic desires, preferences, and intuitions can feel foreign after so long of prioritizing external expectations over internal truth. This inner work requires developing what might feel like a new relationship with yourself, one based on curiosity and compassion rather than criticism and control. You learn to ask yourself questions you might never have considered before. What do I actually enjoy? What energizes me versus what drains me? What are my authentic values separate from what I think I should value? What do I want, not what do I think I should want? These questions can be surprisingly difficult to answer when you've spent years focused on everyone else's needs and desires. Your authentic preferences might feel selfish or unfamiliar. Your genuine interests might seem impractical or unworthy. Learning to honour your inner experience as valid and important is a crucial part of moving from performed strength to authentic living. The process also involves developing new habits and routines that support your authentic self rather than your performed self. This might mean restructuring your schedule to include actual rest time, not just time between helping others. It might mean pursuing hobbies or interests that bring you joy rather than just activities that serve others. It might mean creating physical spaces in your environment that reflect your authentic tastes and preferences rather than what you think is expected or practical. These changes might seem small on the surface, but they represent profound shifts in how you value and prioritize your own experience. Each choice to honor your authentic needs and desires is an act of self-respect that builds your capacity for genuine self-care and authentic relationship with others. Learning to set and maintain boundaries becomes essential to this process. Boundaries aren't walls designed to keep people out. They're guidelines that protect your energy and well-being while allowing for healthy connection with others. For someone who has spent years with very loose or non-existent boundaries, learning to say no, to limit availability, to protect personal time and space can feel almost impossible at first. But boundaries are what make sustainable relationships possible. When you protect your own energy and well-being, you have more genuine capacity to offer to others. When you honor your own limits, you can be more fully present for the commitments you do make. When you take responsibility for your own needs, you stop unconsciously resenting others for not meeting needs they didn't know you had. The practice of setting boundaries often brings up intense guilt, especially for people who learned that their worth was tied to their availability and usefulness to others. You might find yourself feeling cruel when you say no to requests for help, selfish when you prioritize your own needs, or anxious when you're not immediately available to solve everyone's problems. These feelings are normal parts of learning to value your own well-being alongside others. As you develop stronger boundaries and more authentic ways of relating, you might notice changes in your physical health and energy levels. The chronic tension that comes from constantly performing strength often manifests in physical symptoms, headaches, digestive issues, sleep problems, muscle tension, fatigue. As you learn to live more authentically, many people discover that their physical symptoms begin to improve as their emotional and mental stress decreases. Your body has been carrying the weight of performed strength for years, and it needs time to learn new patterns of relaxation and restoration. This might involve learning to breathe more deeply, to release muscle tension you didn't know you were carrying, to sleep more soundly without your mind racing through everyone else's problems and needs. The journey toward authenticity also involves grieving the time and energy you've spent maintaining a performance that was never truly you. This grief is real and important. You've lost years to a way of being that, while it served a purpose, prevented you from experiencing the fullness of your own life. Allowing yourself to feel sadness about this loss is part of honoring both the person who did what they had to do to survive and the person you're becoming who gets to choose differently. But alongside this grief often comes excitement and possibility as you begin to imagine what life might look like when it's aligned with your authentic self rather than your adapted self. You might discover interests and passions that were buried under years of focusing on others' needs. You might find that you have opinions and preferences you never allowed yourself to express. You might realize that your authentic self is more interesting, more complex, more vibrant than the carefully controlled version you've been presenting to the world. And so you find yourself gradually inhabiting a new way of being, one that includes both strength and softness, both capability and need, both the ability to support others and the willingness to be supported. This integrated way of living doesn't eliminate challenges or difficulties, but it allows you to face them with your full humanity rather than a carefully constructed facade. In this space of authenticity, you discover that you haven't lost your strength. You found a way to let it serve your truth rather than hide it. Your capability becomes a tool for creating the life you actually want, rather than a prison that keeps you trapped in patterns that no longer serve you. Your ability to care for others becomes a choice rather than a compulsion, flowing from love rather than obligation. And so tonight, as you've travelled through this landscape of performed strength and discovered the path toward authentic integration, you can finally allow yourself to rest in the truth of who you are. You've looked at the ways you learned to be strong when you needed protection, and you've begun to see that strength not as a burden to carry forever, but as one beautiful part of your complex human story. You're not broken because you learned to hide your struggles. You're not weak because you're tired of being strong for everyone else. You're not selfish because you're beginning to tend your own heart with the same care you've always given to others. You're human, beautifully and completely human, worthy of love not because of what you can do or how much you can carry or how perfectly you can perform, but simply because you exist. Tonight, you can let all the armor rest. You can release the vigilance, soften the shoulders, unlock the jaw, and breathe all the way down into the parts of yourself that have been holding their breath for far too long. You don't have to be strong right now. You don't have to have any answers. You don't have to solve anything or fix anyone or prove anything to anyone, including yourself. You can simply be here, breathing, resting, knowing that your worth was never tied to your usefulness, that your value was never dependent on your invulnerability, that your place in this world was never contingent on being anything other than exactly who you are. The child in you who learned to be strong too early can finally rest, knowing that the adult you've become is learning how to provide the safety and care that child always needed. Sleep well, knowing you are enough, exactly as you are, right now. Rest deeply in the truth that your gentle heart, your complex feelings, your beautiful imperfections, and yes, even your tired strength, are all welcome here. You can let go now. You can simply be. You're safe. You're held. You can rest.